following is presented as an entertainment program emphasizing folklore. It is not intended as legal or medical advice in any way and should not be used to replace the advice of legal or medical professionals. New World Witchery is a Patreon-supported podcast. This episode is sponsored in part by listener Athena Beth. We are ever so grateful for your support and are sending you a box of magical whiteboard markers to use for all of your enchanted chalk talk needs.
If you'd like to become a patron and help support the show while also getting some great perks, please visit www.patreon.com/newworldwitchery, where you can pledge $1 a month or whatever you can to help us buy some magical erasers to help deal with the many monsters and dragons that someone has been drawing all over the board lately, resulting in an awful lot of devoured and finished homework assignments. And thanks to all of our listeners. Are you looking for magic? Maybe magic that lives right where you do?
If so, join us aboard our broomsticks and ride with us from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from the Yukon to the Yucatan, and find magic that's right outside your front door or just off of Route 66.
Whether you're in the Windy City or the Crescent City, the city that never sleeps, or the city of brotherly love, we've got enchantment for you.
I'm Corey.
And I'm Lane, and this is New World Witchery.
In this episode, we speak about reproductive rites with Sophie Saint Thomas. Have you ever looked at artistic representations of witches? Take, for example, Albrecht Dürer's engraving The Four Witches from the late 15th century. In that image, 4 nude women wearing head wraps and draping a bit of fabric at their hips form a small circle, exchanging glances as they seem to move almost as if in a dance together. Or there's John William Waterhouse's The Magic Circle, in which a woman stands by a smoking cauldron surrounded by large ravens, inscribing a mark to encompass her as she works. Her dress is gauzy fabric that contours and shows her body, while in one hand she holds a long wand for casting the circle, and in the other she holds a wicked-looking sickle ready to cut through, well, something. Or there's Francisco Goya's The Witch's Sabbath from 1798, in which a large goat sits at the center of a crowd of women, old and young. One woman is stripped to her waist, and others are in various states of disrobement, while several women seem to be offering up babies, both living and quite deceased, to the goat creature. Bodies and witchcraft, especially bodies that get labeled as female bodies, have an intricate and often dangerous relationship. Nudity and sex and lasciviousness scintillate and tantalize the viewer, mingling forbidden eroticism with forbidden magic. The idea of foregoing motherhood or casting aside children shocked and horrified many who saw these works, cementing the idea that witches were evil for them because of their infanticidal acts as well as their sorceries. Under that skin of witchery, however, is a body that is primed for magic, a body that is powerful when the one inhabiting it chooses to carry life or chooses not to. A body that can dance, seduce, threaten, control, release, and do so many enchanting things. The body of a witch is a dangerous body to those who seek to control it, because the witch alone controls her own body, and only they can choose to relinquish that control for their own purposes and needs. The efforts to control bodies, especially through the control of reproduction, and the efforts to control witches, are also linked. In our episode today, we'll be speaking with Sophie Saint Thomas, who's written extensively about the ways that our bodies can serve us magically through sex, our agency in using body and mind-altering substances to achieve magic, and most recently, the ways that witchcraft trials and the struggle for bodily autonomy have been tied together for centuries. A word of warning that this interview does veer into territory involving gender, sexuality, and the history of things like abortion and the Inquisition. As such, it is an important conversation, but may not be for everyone. For those who do stick with us, though, we hope you enjoy our conversation. Sophie Saint Thomas is an author, journalist, and advocate who's published work in Playboy, GQ, Glamour, Marie Claire, Pride, Vice, Cosmopolitan, Harper's Bazaar, and more. She is a sex columnist for Ask Men and the resident astrologer for Allure magazine. She's published several books, including The Glamour Witch, Weed Witch, Sex Witch, and her newly released Reproductive Rites, the real-life witches and witch hunts in the centuries-long fight for abortion. She writes and advocates for rights and representation in sex, love, and rock and roll, as well as drugs and queer subcultures. Sophie Saint Thomas, welcome to New World Witchery.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Delighted to have you on. Really excited about your new book. Definitely something a little different in the witchy market, and I really appreciate that. So we'll get to that hopefully through the course of the interview. But let's start kind of back with the witchcraft side of this, which has seemingly sort of influenced a lot of the different things that you talk about. And I'm kind of curious, what does that word mean to you? What does it mean to practice witchcraft, to do magic? What does that encompass for you?
Well, there's obviously the spiritual component. And other than that, I think it's just really being aware of your power and not afraid to tap into that.
And so where did your interest start with that? Like, what's kind of your origin story? Is this something that you've always been interested in, or is it something that sort of evolved over time?
I was around various different spiritual practices where I grew up in the Caribbean. There's a lot of voodoo down there. So I was familiar with it. And then when I moved to New York, over 14 years ago, I lived in the East Village, and I lived right next to this witchcraft shop called In that people are probably familiar with if they know New York. And I went in there and started exploring, and it really spoke to me, and has definitely influenced my work.
Yeah, I mean, I think when New York is such a wonderful kind of like point of contact, it's a great crossroads for so many magical traditions. And I also think, as you mentioned, the Caribbean, that also has a lot of cultural crossroads going on there too. You mentioned voodoo, and obviously that is a spiritual practice that is vastly misunderstood, especially kind of outside of the Caribbean. So it's really interesting to see, you kind of in these two different kind of crossroads locations, absorbing the sort of magical traditions there.
It's interesting because both St. Thomas and Manhattan are 13-mile long islands, obviously very different in what has been done with the land. But that has always fascinated with me, that I've spent so much of my life on a 13-mile long island.
That is really interesting. That's really fascinating.
Yeah.
I don't think I would have thought of that. Are there aspects of the practice that you brought in from the Caribbean that you still work with today, or has it sort of evolved more into this urban style of witchcraft?
Not really. Just to be blunt about it, I'm white. Like 90% of people on St. Thomas are Black, but I come from a family that were originally stateside. So I do think that when it comes to Caribbean traditions, that's something that I've tried to be aware of. I don't practice voodoo, and that is not my religion. My own spirituality is very, I would say, personal and unique, but I do think growing up there just made me more comfortable with different magical traditions and perhaps more accepting and open to different types of spiritualities.
That's really wonderfully put. This idea that it not something that you didn't feel like you had any ownership over the practices, but you were able to be more open-minded to other practices. I think that's kind of wonderful. And so then you move to New York City, you start kind of encountering magic and witchcraft here. And then you're also sort of pursuing this career as a writer. And a lot of what you're writing about is stuff that stays pretty taboo in a lot of circles. These things that might get called vice. You've written about sex, marijuana, witchcraft as well, right? And one of the kind of interesting cross points there is that they're all very self-defining activities. They're things that we do as a sort of way to figure out who we are as much as sort of enjoy the pleasurable activity of them. So I'm kind of curious, what has been your sort of relationship with these sort of different quote unquote vices, and how do you talk about them to people who maybe are still kind of in that zone of taboo?
I don't know if this is a cop-out answer, but I don't really talk about, they're not really taboo. And all my friends are either like also sex writers or in the cannabis space or self-identifying witches. I don't know. I hate to say that as a cop-out answer, but I think I'm lucky that living in New York, that hasn't really been an issue for me. I recently got married, and some of my in-laws are more conservative, and I was talking to them about my book, which is about, abortion. And I ended up actually talking to them about how, like eugenics have a part of the history, which is kind of like dark and like problematic, I think, even in more, maybe even more so in pro-choice circles, to like say and acknowledge. Because one of the things I found researching this book is that liberals, and I am a liberal, but I've become very, I guess, critical of that, is that, there is a darkness in like the history of abortion. And like, let's see, like, for instance, like Margaret Sanger of Planned Parenthood did like use eugenics to sell the birth control thing. And so it was interesting. I know I'm veering off a little bit of what you asked me, but I actually have found that in writing this book, ended up having more common grounds to talk about things with people whose point of views do not actually align with mine.
Yeah, no, and that's I love that direction. That's really interesting, and I think it's really fascinating that, and maybe this comes from sort of your journalistic background, that sort of unabashed honesty, that unabashed sort of ability to look things in the face and say this is what they are, and not try to sugarcoat the fact that the Margaret Sanger eugenics connection exists in the history of the reproductive justice movement. So I appreciate that a lot.
Yeah, it totally existed. It's interesting. It wasn't even though that she was so much of a eugenicist. The thing about her is that she was like a politician, and eugenics were really popular at the time. And she actually first tried to market birth control as just a way for women to enjoy the pleasure of sex without worrying about getting pregnant. And when she kind of pivoted to the eugenic side, it was more just because she was trying to find mass appeal. So that was really interesting to me too, is that it wasn't even that she was like a true believer in eugenics, is that she was willing to kind of do whatever it took to sell the birth control.
Yeah. That kind of gets into something really interesting, which is, I mean, not to veer too far off of the sort of like facing down that sort of darker history, as you're saying, but, her kind of initial point is, no, I want to sell this as something that women can take and then enjoy sex, right? They can enjoy sex and not have to worry about pregnancy. And I mean, so much of what you've written about falls into that sort of like, acknowledging that we are beings that want pleasure, that we are pleasure-seeking creatures. But that's something that can run into a lot of resistance. I mean, in your research, have you kind of seen this? Have you seen any patterns with that? Like, have you found any sort of like reason underneath, like why pleasure is so threatening to so many people?
I mean, I do think it comes back to control. We still see that with like J.D. Vance, who's the idea of like of a woman who without children seems to be like the absolute just worst thing he can think about. I want to be careful and not sound like I'm talking too much shit about like women who do, like mothers and women who do have children. And I know we had want to talk about reproductive justice as opposed to reproductive rights. What reproductive justice does emphasis on the ability to have and parent with dignity as much as it does the right not to parent with dignity. But being a mother it's a full-time job completely. And for so long, that was kind of the only job that women were allowed to have. And I think that historically, but even now, using like J.D. Vance as the example, it's just so many people are just only comfortable with that being the role that women take. And I think there is like an aspect of control in that, because if like a woman is at home with her kids, then she's just not upsetting the way some people think society is meant to be.
Yeah, that sort of it eliminates the threat. And I think it's also, worth noting when we talk about, that being a mother is a full-time job. And at the same time, many women were expected to do that and also take on additional work, doing things like laundry services or things like that. And oftentimes that would be, people of color. It would be people who were at the bottom end of the sort of economical margins of society as well, that are doing both the full-time job of motherhood and the full-time job, or at least part-time job of bringing in income as well. So, I mean, certainly it's hard to fight back when you're exhausted. So I think that you've raised a really good point there.
Yeah. And it's interesting because now we've come like so full circle in a lot of ways that like I've noticed like younger women, it's no longer even seen that like rejecting motherhood to have a career, which is kind of which is the type of person that I am. Like, I don't want kids. I just want to write all the time. But, now there's this new point of view that's really like critical of that, honestly, and would find that like too capitalist. Like that there's women now, who really want to be able to just be moms or to just stay home and not have to work. And like that's most of like the most liberal women I've like talked to and interviewed recently about that. They don't want to work. Like they don't want to be girl bosses or they just want to be able to be mothers and so that's important too. But that is really interesting to me how the culture has kind of shifted. So now people are in a lot of ways advocating for their right to do that instead of the right to work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was a piece in the Washington Post this past week where there was sort of a hand wringing about the birth rate in the United States dropping below the quote unquote replacement rate and this choice to have kids or not have kids. And it is interesting. People do seem to spill a lot of ink and get a lot of anxiety about, what that choice entails. Very interesting. Let's jump ahead because we mentioned this concept of reproductive justice. Your new book, Reproductive Rites, really follows this concept of reproductive justice. And you do make a very specific choice kind of early in the book to say, I'm going to talk about this as reproductive justice. That's the term that you go into. So I'm curious, can you talk a little bit about why that term and what does that mean?
It was coined by Loretta J. Ross, an activist. I think it was first used in 1994. And it's really just, bringing the concept of social justice to reproductive rights. So it's not, reproductive rights kind of historically speak more to, I guess, maybe women in my position, women who don't want children and like want to be able to have access to birth control and abortions. But reproductive justice, I would say it's more comprehensive of whatever your reproductive choices are, whether that's to parent with dignity, to not have children, and with a social justice element infused into that. But I think I was particularly interested in that term because while in some ways, I think when most people hear that and they think of these kind of like more modern day concepts of social justice and see it as a more recent incarnation of reproductive rights, I found that it actually was really similar to what I saw going on in antiquity in like the days of ancient Egypt. In the first chapter of Reproductive Rights, I talk about how like back in the day, people would go and worship at the Nile, perform these like various rituals and to petition the gods. And when they would go to the gods back then, they didn't really have to differentiate whether they were going there with the desire to get pregnant, to prevent pregnancy, or to terminate a pregnancy. It was kind of all seen as the same thing. Mm-hmm. And then I think, maybe in the 70s and 80s, or maybe a little earlier, during the birth control movement, and then in the time of Roe, those were kind of really split. It's like you either, it's like the moms and you want kids, and then it's like the people who don't want children and want access to abortion and want access to birth control. And I feel like reproductive rights got a little severed from motherhood, if that makes sense. And then reproductive justice starts, gaining momentum now. And that to me kind of reminded me like, that not that we're at the end, but like the end is in the beginning. So I don't even think it's so much as like a more modern term, even though of course, Loretta Ross deserves credit for coining it and like popularizing it. But to me, the idea is actually a very ancient one. And it's almost as if society kind of is going back to its roots in terms of the way we discuss reproductive options. And that was very interesting to me.
Yeah. And I mean, this sense that this is something that is rooted in sort of even ancient experiences of birth and, reproduction, sex as well. Just sort of, the idea that the ancients didn't necessarily view sex as solely an act of reproduction, but acknowledge that there were times that you were having sex that were not about making babies. So, yeah. And I think that's totally really interesting for sure. And so, you're charting this, you have some really interesting stories in here where you're also linking a number of these sort of reproductive justice moments in history to things that we might associate with, witchcraft, or at least witchcraft adjacent things. You have the smiling covens of happy midwives, I think was a quote in there at one point. Or the story of Lavozan, right? Who's this holding like black masses, things like that as a component of all this. And I'm curious, for you, does witchcraft also require that sort of justice-oriented mindset?
I mean, it I would say kind of critically that it doesn't require it because there's a lot of really shady people. I mean, it's I mean, the nice answer to give you is like, yes, I believe it requires it. If you're calling yourself a witch, you should be rooted in social justice. But I actually, in a lot of ways, I have to be honest, researching this book became a little repulsed by aspects of the witchcraft community. Just for instance, doing deep dives into characters like Crowley, he's a big character in the book. And everyone knows like, okay, Crowley is kind of a scumbag, but then also every time I go to like a friend's house, I see his books on their shelf, or like maybe they have like, the Thoth Tarot, and like I do too, but I I don't know. And I've talked to him about people, and they're like, he was, he was provocative. That was his whole thing. But I read just book after book after book on the man, and I mean, he had women that he was involved with, multiple, like committed for to insane asylums when they didn't deserve it. He completely abandoned his children. He was just, he was cruel. He was racist. He was like super super racist, and I don't know. I just got kind of like grossed out by it all. And that's not to like say that, of course, there's a lot of really amazing who identify as witches who like make social justice a part of their practice. I'm friends with many of them, and a lot of them appear as characters in the book. But I have one. I don't know. I like learned too much writing this book, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I definitely learned too much. So I mean, no, I don't think it's a requirement, just because there's, just looking at it as a journalist, there's just too much evidence of some of like the biggest names in occult history who definitely did not care about social justice. And I think there's a lot of people in the witchcraft space who, just to be honest, just like haven't done their research, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Right. And yeah, you kind of wind up in a situation where you've been staring into the abyss, and the abyss is staring back, and it's kind of awful in some ways.
Yeah, no, completely.
Well, I'm curious. So then, as you said, we have, I mean, and this comes down to the same thing that you're saying with, looking at Sanger and the eugenics movement, and saying like, look, let's look at this honestly. Let's be clear about this. Being clear about the history of witchcraft too. We have to acknowledge that it's not all, a persecuted minority that should have been able to do everything they wanted freely. And, Crowley is not to be, held up as a sort of paragon or saint of witchcraft history either.
I know. Crowley like hates me. I like, oh my God, I can't, his followers hate me. I'm like scared for this book to come out. Like, I'm like, I am not kind to him. And I actually think I might be related to him, which is really interesting. Yeah, I found like a connection looking at one of his family trees, but I like did like a tarot reading with like the Thoth deck, and I just like pulled one card, and I'm like, Crowley, like, what's up with this book? What do you think? And I got the Tower card, and like, I'm just like, I can't. And I'm like, but that's because he knows that I spent like a whole chapter talking shit about him. Yeah.
Well, if it makes you feel better, I'm sure you're not the first, and you won't be the last to critically reevaluate Crowley, thankfully. But yeah, no, I mean, it can be very intimidating when you realize kind of what you're up against with the reputation of something like that. Oh my goodness. So for you though, it does sound like the sort of justice oriented mindset is important to you within kind of your own practice and your own understanding. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is. Although I do want to be clear that this book is definitely like not about my practice. I guess I was doing another interview, and they asked me like, it's clear that you really made like a priority to make social justice a part of this book. And like, that's true, but that's like that's just me telling the truth, if that makes sense. Like that became a big part of the book because that is the history, like I just want it to be clear that I want to be clear that the social justice elements are in this book because like they deserve to be. And because as a journalist, I found out they're a crucial part of the history rather than me to win any sort of points, I guess.
Right. That you're documenting that history as opposed to necessarily trying to wedge a new identity or wedge a new perspective into that history. You're saying this is what is actually in the history if you look at it, right?
It's just I'm not just talking about social justice for like the sake of
Mm-hmm.
talking about social justice. I'm telling it because that's what, after like 2 years of research, it is like this is a huge part of the story. No, and it just deserves to be looked at from a complete like an unbiased, this is part of history, because it deserves to be point of view. It is all I want to make clear.
Right. Yeah. And as you said, you're not necessarily using this book as a and here's a reproductive justice spell for you to do kind of a thing. This is much more of a let's look in the mirror of ourselves clearly and understand ourselves better through this history, which I really appreciate.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it does make it very unique in that kind of witchcraft space, because I know there's a lot of pressure to sort of be like, okay, but where are the spells, right? Where's your section on like herbal correspondences and such things?
I can't do that anymore. I can't. And this like, I mean, I don't know. I don't want to like sound like I'm talking too much shit, because I did read some books that had like rituals for reproductive justice, and in the book I write about, for instance, in the final chapter, it's like talks about people who hex Brett Kavanaugh, and obviously rituals like that exist. But I mean, we're talking about healthcare, I guess. Like I think if you need an abortion, or that there's some instances, where you just need to like go to a doctor, and I just wanted to be really careful in this book that I wasn't dissuading anyone from getting medical advice, I guess.
Right. It's one thing to know that crocodile dung was used in ancient Egypt, but we have other options now. And you're saying maybe go visit the Planned Parenthood clinic and talk to the medical professionals in there. Get good medical advice.
Completely. Yeah. I mean, herbal abortions still take place, and it's interesting. And a lot of people who seek out kind of alternative abortion practices, unfortunately, are doing it because they can't afford to get a safe one, or they don't have access to get a safe one. And so I guess for me, I not that I have like a negative connotation with it, but when I didn't want to like to put like a spell to get an abortion when that just feels icky and unsafe. And I wanted to be advocating for safe access to medical or, surgical abortions, instead of giving like a spell with like papaya seeds or something,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, and I think you've done a very good job of kind of directing people to see this as a centuries long. I don't even know if struggle encompasses the word, but a centuries long movement within culture to try to gain this autonomy and gain this sort of control of self and body. And I think you do a very good job of that without necessarily turning it into, and here's how you can use papaya seeds, and here's a deity you could appeal to. But I am curious, in the process of this, were there historical like characters or historical, rituals or anything kind of within that sort of caught you by surprise and really opened up doors for you? Like, were there ones that, people that you now like are really glad that you've come to know through this research?
Yeah, let's see. I actually think some of the most interesting characters I learned about were people I learned about from reading pro-life texts, just because I was already pretty well educated in the pro-choice history. But there was a period about halfway through my research where I looked at the pile of books I was using to research it, and I realized that they all had the same point of view that I had. And I just realized how that was poor journalism. So I bought a bunch of books written by pro-life authors, and they weren't stupid or uninformed. They were really well researched and really well written, and kind of used to the left's tendency to underestimate its opposition. But I learned about people that I just had never heard of, and like Saint Joan. She's not really a saint, but she was a pro-life martyr in the 80s, I believe. And he like went to prison for the wild like attacks she did on like she was just this pro-life crusader who ended up in prison, and then she like had a fake eye, and she was like chucking her fake
Mm.
eye at a prison guard, and then the prison guard like just handed it back to her. And at one point, like Mother Teresa was like, let out Joan and she can come stay with me. And Joan Andrews is her name, turned down Mother Teresa's offer, and because she wanted to continue to stay in like prison and like make her point. And that was just really fascinating to me, that there were these pro-life icons like Saint Joan who were such a big deal in that scene, that they, you know, garnered the protection of Mother Teresa, and I had just never heard about them. And not only had I never heard about them, but when I like put their name into Google, there was so little search results that it felt like no one really outside of these pro-life readers had heard about them. And that was really interesting. It was also really interesting to learn that especially around like the Middle Ages, like people really did like make pacts with the devil and sometimes kill babies in woods. There's just a lot of things that sound like kind of legends, but actually really, really happened. And that was really interesting to me too.
Yeah, I mean it's not a glossy history, especially when you're dealing with witchcraft. There are multiple facets to it, and it can get quite dark.
Yeah, completely.
For sure. And so you've got this book, Reproductive. We've also written books, obviously, that are very much sort of focused on, even the idea of sort of sex positive advocacy, which, that can be its own sort of taboo topic. And I'm kind of curious, have there been like misconceptions or challenges that you've run into as you try to have witchcraft and sexuality sort of come into contact with one another through your writing or through your research?
I guess the most interesting misconception to me is like at the book launch party for my Glamour Witch book, which came out after Sex Witch, I was talking to a guy in the occult space, and he was asking me what I was doing next. And this had been like right around the time I was pitching this book, Reproductive Rites. And I was like, I want to write like a book about witch hunts and abortion. And he was so shocked, and he looked so confused, and he was like, why would the author of like Sex Witch like write about something so dark? And to me, it was like the stupidest question I had ever heard, because obviously you need sex like to get abortion, right? To me, they're like directly related. But I guess it made me realize how separate some other people think of them. Like they think that sex is this like fun, like, just like kinky, sexy, happy thing. And then abortion is this, dark and like other ways taboo thing. But I mean, they're all connected. And so I think actually reproductive rights is a natural next step for someone who's written something like Sex Witch. But a lot of people don't like to really think about the consequences of sex, I guess. And obviously that's part of the birth control movement is to make sure that people can have sex without consequence. But I guess I don't want abortion, reproductive rights to be seen as such like a dark and dirty separate side of the sex thing. I think it will be best served us if we just see them all part of the same conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, and there's also so much that goes on even beyond the sort of bodily components of sexuality that can get tied up in both the experience of sexuality and the experience of, bodily autonomy, social justice. People can do real damage to their psychological states by, getting too caught up in one side or the other, sort of getting lost in the sort of silly, let's see, happy side of sex without thinking about those consequences, or, getting so caught up in kind of the darkness that they don't, remember to enjoy it every once in a while, I think, too.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. It's definitely a really good point.
Yeah. And I'm kind of curious, you've got this book that's focused very much on this sort of history of reproductive justice and this, as you said, witch hunts. And I think that's such an interesting term too, because that's getting very much sort of co-opted and politicized as well by multiple sides. This is not just like one side is co-opting it, but people really love to use that term to mean sort of any kind of persecution. And I'm curious, from your perspective of having read through so many of these witch hunt accounts and seeing that, sometimes there's cause, sometimes there's not cause, right? How do you feel about the way that we're talking about witch hunts now?
Well, the witches, whether someone is actually practicing magic or not, unfortunately, doesn't always play in a role whether they're called a witch or not. But to me, for it to be a witch hunt, there needs to be oppression present. The witch is maligned, and I get upset when Donald Trump says it, because
Mm-hmm.
a person of that wealth and privilege is not a witch. They're not to me, a witch is someone who, whether they deserve it or not, has been oppressed, and there's a power imbalance, by the one, like the Inquisition is a great example, because it was in the Inquisition I talk about. I think that's the most realistic witch hunt, I guess, because I actually kind of took a big issue with what happened in Salem, because after I did my research, I was really not convinced that there was actual. I mean, I know people love to romanticize Salem, so I feel like I'm going to get shit for this
Mm-hmm.
from the witch community, but I really think Salem was a bunch of hysterical kids. These Puritans were in the New World. They were so scared of attacks from indigenous tribes. And I mean, kind of rightfully so. It was a bloody time, but I think it was just a complete, I think the Salem witch trials are a great example of what happens when fear gets totally spiraled out of control, but that was Puritans calling other Puritans witches because what these thrashing children were saying. And actually, let me know if I'm jumping around too much, reminded me a lot about the 80s satanic panic, when we had all these cries about satanic child abuse when it wasn't actually really happening.
Mm-hmm.
But people still ended up spending years and years in jail for something that didn't happen, which is exactly what happened in Salem. I think people time in jail, and in some cases even died, because of the hysterics of children backed up by terrified parents. But so I think those are kind of false witch hunts. But then in the Inquisition, you have the Inquisition, which, we've come to kind of talk about as this noun describing the witch hunts themselves. But the Inquisition actually refers to an office within the Catholic Church whose job was to find and root out witches. And there's this character, Beatrice de Plana Solis. I'm probably butchering her last name, but who I write about. And she actually, I think, might have done spell work, but she was mostly interesting to me because she was an early advocate of birth control. And she, in her postmenopause years, still had all these younger boyfriends. And she also ended up in jail, and the Catholics went after her. And to me, that's a really actual witch hunt. You have people in a position of power going after someone who's oppressed and maligned. That's a witch hunt. People attacking Trump for hypocrisy is just not a witch hunt. The power imbalance is all wrong, and also he's a former president, maybe future president again. People have a right to be critical of their leaders, and in fact that's really, really important. So yeah, I would call bullshit on his, or I guess any person of his level of powers use of that term.
No, that's really well explained. Yeah. And I mean, you mentioned the Salem component of that. One of the things I think is so interesting is, like you said, a lot of this is young people who are kind of sort of letting things spiral out of control in terms of, particularly thinking about the spectral evidence component of this. But then you also have, the Putnams and the Porters who are kind of also in land disputes. And so there's this complex series of things going on there. And with the Catholic Inquisition as well, there's a lot of witch hunts that spring up mostly around the Reformation period, when they're coming into conflict with Protestants. And I think that's really interesting that, as you said, it's almost always this looking for somebody that we can sort of target that is in a position of less power. But it's always interesting because it seems to be a sort of redirect from the main conflict. And I'm not curious if that's something that you've seen, in other places as well, with the sort of history of this.
Oh, I mean, totally. I mean, one of the reasons why I got so bothered about Salem is because I kept, reading these testimonies, and they're like, what did the devil look like? They're like, it was a dark man. It was a man with dark skin. And I'm like, okay, they're talking about the
Mm-hmm.
indigenous tribes, like, and at the same time that the Salem witch trials were going on, like slavery was starting in the continental, what would become the continental United States of America.
Mm-hmm.
And people, I'm like shocked about how people don't talk about this enough, but there was witch hunts against enslaved Americans and indigenous people. And I don't mean that in like a metaphorical sense. Like, yes,
Mm-hmm.
there was oppression, violence, but there was like actual, like, you are a witch because you practice this and we are going to hunt you. And that was happening on just such a big scale when it comes to like when enslaved Americans were brought here, and like enslavers looked at their magical practices or their spiritual practices, and then went after them for that, and the same thing was happening to indigenous peoples. And there was like these two witch hunts going on, just such a massive, massive, massive scale. And yet when you hear the term like witch hunts for like the colonial era, everyone thinks of Salem.
Mm-hmm.
And like I think like less like 19 people, it depends how you count the death, but I think it was like 19 people totally died. And it's just it's really fascinating to me that both popular culture and the occult world are just so fascinated with that, because I just don't think at some points in my research I was like, is this like a red herring,
Mm-hmm.
like it's just yeah, that was definitely not. I mean, it's interesting. It's interesting in the way that, again, to make the connection, to me, it's interesting in the way that like the 80s satanic panic is
Mm-hmm.
interesting, looking at kind of what like hysteria can birth and create. But there was like two massive, 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 way, way deadlier witch hunts going on at the same time. And for whatever reason, like the witch hunt aspect of what happened with indigenous peoples and enslaved Americans just isn't discussed in the same way.
Yeah, no, that is really interesting. And I mean, and you think about like, even in Salem, you had, the people of color, the enslaved woman Candy, Tituba, Mary Black, who would get accused,
Yeah,
but then they didn't actually, they were never the ones who got hung. They would be in prison, but never hung,
no.
because they were sort of, it was a self-devouring thing where the Puritans were going after the Puritans, which I think is so interesting. And then the indigenous thing that you mentioned makes me think of, do you know about Pope's Rebellion in the Southwest?
Mm-mm.
So that was also during kind of the Spanish colonization efforts in the Southwest, and they would accuse, I think he was a Zuni leader named Pope, of being a sorcerer and doing witchcraft. The like local Catholic missions would, and and so Pope was like, I'm not a witch. I don't know what you're saying. But then he realized that they were really afraid of the idea of him being a witch. So he's like, oh wait, I am a witch. So he leans
Oh,
into
that is interesting.
and uses it to sort of launch a rebellion against the Catholic church in the area. But you're right, yeah.
Interesting.
But that's the stuff that doesn't get taught in history classes as much.
Yeah,
We know that like
completely.
19 people hung, one person pressed to death, and then two dogs hung, which is always really
Yeah,
sad. And so we know that
yeah, I
stuff, but
know.
but not this other stuff. So I really do appreciate you writing this book, because I think you're going to introduce people to a lot of really important stories and a lot of really important narratives about this history and this trajectory. So I just wanted to say I appreciate you doing that.
So thank you for talking about it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you doing the work. I should also say, this is a very serious, important topic, and we've covered quite a lot here. But you do also work with, I'm curious, where is pop culture in all of this for you?
I love pop culture. I mean, pop culture is modern day folklore to
Mm-hmm.
me. It's really just a way to communicate with people, I guess. I'm trying to think of an example. I mean, it just becomes part of the story, in the last chapter of Reproductive Rites, the
Mm-hmm.
modern day chapter. It's like I talk about how like Lady Gaga got roped into like the QAnon like satanic panic that's going on, and
Mm-hmm.
was like being accused of killing babies in you know pizza shops.
Oh yeah,
I
comic ping
guess,
pong.
yeah, the Comet Ping Pong.
Mm-hmm.
But I love pop culture, and I find pop culture just a really great way to, I guess, connect and relate to people.
Yeah, well, I'm kind of curious. I guess what I'm really kind of wondering is, do you feel like we when we get into pop culture, we also have this idea of like the witch in pop culture, right? The witch in popular culture, which can range from Margaret Hamilton to, the Harry Potter, the Agatha All Along, all this kind of sort of these depictions of witches. Do you feel like there is value in sort of leaning into that as a community? Can we use that in some way to accomplish some of these kind of bigger goals, some of the things that you talk about as part of this sort of trajectory in reproductive rights?
We can, but I usually don't find it always totally accurate. Like, for instance, in the 80s chapter, I've had so much fun writing about Nancy Reagan, and I like
Mm-hmm.
hate to piss anyone else off by like suggesting that Nancy Reagan is a witch, but like she did some real witchy things. She consulted with an astrologer daily. Joan Quigley was the White House astrologer who was being used to consult even on the departure of Air Force Ones. So the Reagans were using astrology throughout their whole presidency. And then she used the color red in a really like color magic centric way. She like understood that it had these connotations of power, and I think honestly even sexuality. And so it's interesting. There's like the Reagans in the White House like using astrology within their political dealings, but no one like thought of them as witches. And at the same time they're doing this, they're very like hypocritically using like occult narratives in a fear mongering way to like drive home their political points. And then, everyone's like calling like Stevie Nicks a witch, or and I mean, I love Stevie Nicks, and I think she is a witch, but there was just so like, especially in the 80s, there's always just like so much hypocrisy going on about when it comes to the occult narrative. And it's interesting, and like the Reagans and their astrologer, that's not a secret at all, but no one would ever like associate them with witchcraft. And maybe that's just because a lot of the times witches lean liberal, and they don't want like Nancy Reagan being called a witch. But it probably has more to do with the fact that the Reagans were really good at marketing themselves. They were also really interesting to me because the Reagan presidency is this huge moment in America in like the takeover of conservative politics. But at least when it comes to like reproductive rights, the Reagans gave a lot more lip service to the issue than actually making laws that got in the way of Roe. Like, like Ronald Reagan like appointed like Sandra Day O'Connor. The Reagans were like, they're just Hollywood actors, which we knew they are. They just used all this they're not as conservative as like they pretend to be, which I found really fascinating. I read an interview with the Reagan's daughter who said that behind closed doors, like Nancy Reagan was always talking about how she was pro-choice. But then, you read her astrologer's memoir, and the first time her astrologer met Nancy Reagan, she was giving an anti-abortion speech. So, Nancy Reagan would go out and give these speeches against abortion, but then back in the White House at like a dinner party, be like, oh yeah, I'm pro-choice. So the Reagans like really tricked the conservatives, in my point of view. They really, Ronald Reagan as governor of California passed the Therapeutic Abortion Act, which kind of ironically made California one of the most prepared states when Roe was overturned. But then he like sold himself into this pro-life icon, and so much of it was just this Hollywood actor bullshitting people to keep power. I know I kind of veered off topic from your
No, that's wonderful. I love that
question, but yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, and the Nancy Reagan, I mean, like you were saying earlier, like it's hard to see her as a witch because of the sort of like power dynamics, but at the same time, being a woman associated with a conservative, political figure, there is a little bit of a like, there's a role you're expected to play.
I just mean it's interesting. Like if it was like a liberal musician and you're like, she's using an astrologer and color magic, you would be like, those are witchy things, right?
But for sure, yeah.
But we like really don't want to say that about Nancy Reagan, but she was doing them. So that was very interesting to me.
Yeah, that is fascinating. I love that. I could sit here. We could sit here and ramble for quite a long time, digging through all this fascinating history. But I encourage people to go check out your book, find this history for themselves through your work. I think you've done a wonderful job with this. I know this is kind of what you're working on. You're going to be promoting this for quite a while. Are you making other plans for future projects at this point? Are you, looking forward to some time off down the road? Like, what's coming next for you?
I'm actually trying to switch to fiction. I am really trying to do that. I don't even want to talk too much about that, but
sure.
Yeah, I think I want to write novels going forward. I mean, this book, I am so proud of this book, but this, I spent a very hard 2 years writing this, and I'm so proud of what came out, but it would be nice creatively to do something, I don't want to use the word lighthearted, but a little more artistic maybe after this, because this book was just so research heavy. So yeah, we'll see. I will keep you updated.
Absolutely. Fascinating. If people want to find you, what are the best places for them to look for you?
I've been kind of dwindling down my social media use. I'm mostly just on Instagram now. So you can follow me there at the Bowie Cat. Bowie like David Bowie, and Cat like you're familiar.
And we'll also make sure that there's a link to your website where they can catch up on previous works that you've done and keep an eye out for the new book as it's coming out in bookstores too. So thank you so much. Sophie Saint Thomas, thank you so much for being with us here at New World Witchery. Here in Scorpio season, we might be more aware than ever of our bodies and the things they want. And we may be more aware than ever that we are in the presence of those who came before us, ancestors whose bodies were perhaps not as free as our own. However you choose to honor your body, your reproductive rights, and your history, we hope that this conversation has been useful to you. Our thanks to Sophie Saint Thomas for being our guest. We'll link her latest book and her website in our show notes. We'd also like to thank our Patreon supporters for continuing to offer their support to us. You can join them at patreon.com/newworldwitchery, where you can throw $1 a month or whatever you can into our hat and get some interesting and fun perks along the way, including access to special bonus episodes and things like early releases for new episodes, and participate in our Discord server, our ongoing book club. We've got Secret Krampus coming up, all sorts of fun things. If you have thoughts on this episode or any other, feel free to share those with us, compassandkey@gmail.com or newworldwitcherypodcast@gmail.com. And you can visit us at newworldwitchery.com to read over 250 articles on folk magic, hear all of our past 250 plus episodes, and just find us on social media and other various places as well. So thank you so much for joining us this time around. We hope that you are having a wonderful turn to the dark time of the year, and that you are enjoying Scorpio season and all that comes with it. So until next time, thanks for listening. Be well. New World Witchery is a production of New World Witchery Podcasts and is released under a Creative Commons Share and Share Alike license. The title and closing music for this episode is Woman Blues by Paul Avgernos, licensed from AudioSocket.